Welcome to Adapted, the podcast where we explore adaptations in various forms. I'm today's host, Tom, and with me is...
Matt.
And KJ.
Today we'll be discussing a Game of Thrones from 1996 and its adaptation, Game of Thrones from 2011.
In Game of Thrones, we follow the noble Eddard Stark, who has just been asked to be Hand of the King by his buddy growing up, King Robert, down in King's Landing. King Robert is married to Queen Cersei, who is having an affair with her brother, and there is suspicion that the heir to the throne is indeed not King Robert's son, but Cersei and her brothers. Eddard Stark plays a bit of a detective in this first book, in this first season of Game of Thrones, trying to puzzle out exactly what's going on in King's Landing. At the same time, we follow the last Targaryen, Dany Targaryen, on the other side of the Narrow Sea, where she joins the Dothraki as a queen. And today, we're going to be primarily focused on the first book, A Game of Thrones, and the first season of the TV show Game of Thrones. But, spoilers, we will probably get into all the books, all of the show, and possibly even a few of the chapters that have been published from the unreleased book, Winds of Winter. So, all spoilers are on the table out there, audience.
You had brought this forward a few points you wanted to make, which were discussed offline, which had to be which were related to why did the author George R.R. Martin feel that this wouldn't work on television, that his book was written with the idea that it could not be televised as he claimed. So you brought that forward. What do you think? Why did he think this couldn't be televised or adapted?
Well, a little history here. So before George R. R. Martin started writing A Game of Thrones, he was writing primarily for television. I think he started with a few short stories in fanzines. You guys ever hear of fanzines?
Yeah, and he won a few awards too. I think he won like the Nebula Award for short fiction for one of his works that I looked into, which was pretty creepy. But yeah, he had kind of been known in the short fiction world.
And then was doing TV. And then I don't know if he was frustrated with TV or just wanted to try something different. So when he started A Song of Ice and Fire and when he started A Game of Thrones, one of the things that he was putting into the novel was that it cannot be televised. Now, some of that might be because of the special effects, right? The grandiose, the budget, the R rating, the scale. But apart from that, what do you guys think George R. R. Martin included in A Game of Thrones that he thought would prevent it from being on TV?
I just want to say, because I didn't know any of this. I'm sure you guys are going to be far more aware of this. So I'm coming from this from the only, as whatever, Tom, you're the English person here. Like, what are the textual analysis? Only the text. I only know the text, none of the external. What is that called?
Death to the author.
Yeah, the death to the authher concept. Oh, that's
whatever. Yeah,
from
that,
the new criticism. They call
yes,
that close reading.
So I got none of this. I got no. No, but seriously, I didn't know that, which I thought was funny because when I was reading the book, I thought, oh, he totally wrote this because he knew this was going to be a TV thing, which makes sense if he was writing television things before that, because it's very cinematic and it's very episodic. Each sort of sequence it just sort of feels like, and here's this scene. They're all very encapsulated. They all kind of function in a single line, and then they end, and then the next sequence starts with a new character perspective, which is it struck me as very television episodic sort of approach to it. So it's funny that you say that he wrote it so it couldn't be filmed, yet it feels like he wrote it as a treatment for a or a television script. So, but I suspect that is partially because if he was writing for television beforehand and was frustrated with it, he took that sort of approach to it into his writing here. So that might explain why that is. If he's saying he did it without that, I think it's all the things we just said. I think it's the scope, it's the scale. It's in 1996, could you have put incest on television? It would have been a stretch. I don't think you could have done that. I don't think you could have put a lot of the sheer violence, the sheer scope. It doesn't even need to be scope. It's the violence, it's the sexuality, it's the taboos. I mean, he pretty much touches on every social taboo that you could, ranging from incest to basically necrophilia, practically. It's just he's got everything that you could possibly go through, and I suspect that's at least got to be part of it. It's not quite like Ray Bradbury saying like trying to just go off against censorism or censorship or this kind of stuff, but I think he was intentionally trying to just do all the provocative stuff you can't put on screen. And then social more has changed in 15 years and you could put it on screen.
Yeah, and I also think he didn't know because he started writing the book, I think in 1991, I read, and it comes out in 97. The Sopranos comes out in 99. And I think what The Sopranos did is it it made it clear that this new model that HBO was working on for television could be really successful, which was this is no longer a second grade medium anymore. This is kind of a medium for, I hate this, but it's a medium for adults. I hate that phrase, but it kind of rings true, right? It's The Sopranos used very serious subject matter. It used a lot of nudity. It used a lot of these kind of adult content type things, but it was also very cinematic, right? It's referencing kind of these great kind of mob movies of the early 90s back down to the 70s. And it's doing it in a way that is sort of respectful, not second tier. And I think Game of Thrones, George R. R. Martin's view of Game of Thrones is it is this kind of cinematic world. And what HBO managed to do, and I think you do need the CGI to catch up. You do need that to be affordable in order to make King's Landing and then eventually the dragons and all that type of thing. But HBO also gave a lot of power over to the creators, and it sort of has been working on making television something like cinema, right? Something on par with the kind of seriousness of cinema. And if you read at least the first book of Songs of Ice and Fire, Fire and Ice, Ice and Fire. Okay, Ice and Fire. George
Fire
R.
and Ice
R.
is a
Martin.
restaurant.
Oh, is it? um, he takes this material very seriously. He's very serious with the story he's telling. This is not a kind of fun time, and I think HBO has those pretenses of making, and I mean that in a good way, pretenses of making television the medium of the 21st century, where movies were maybe the medium of the 20th century. I think HBO is not the only company doing this, only producers doing this, but I think like The Sopranos is a big game changer, and I think that type of ambition for television is what he did not foresee not foresee it existing in 1991, and because of HBO became possible when it comes to the small screen in 2011.
And I think this is a little off of the direction I want to go eventually. But the other thing that changed was in the early 90s, even through the 90s, television was broadcast. And there was no way to block it from the children, right? If you had a TV in your house, the children could see whatever was on there. With the accessibility of a digital cable box where you could block certain channels, and then even more so with streaming now where you can parent control that thing like crazy, you now can release The Sopranos and Game of Thrones and things that are more risque without someone who doesn't want their kids to see that having their kids stumble across that. I think that also the accessibility and
Mhm.
control of that accessibility also allows for more TV shows like this.
There's also I think that's very true. I think that you once you are able to control what is visible, it's you don't need to scramble the Skinamax at 2 a.m. kind of thing. But I think there's also, Tom, I think you're right that there's also that element, but I think it goes even further back than Sopranos, and especially if you're saying that he started this in 1991, because I think the first great piece of television that's the closest thing, this is when it starts. This is when television really starts to go into almost a film media, is Twin Peaks.
Okay.
That's when you really start. That's the first time I would argue that film quality direction and sort of values come to television. and that continues right through the 90s into things like the X-Files and all these kind of shows that sort of they take themselves seriously. They're perfectly fine with it. And Twin Peaks is like, I mean, it's gory, it's rough, it's weird. It's that
Mhm.
David Lynch. It's truly that's the first time that film quality gets onto into television. Now I mean, again, there are other examples. Things you go things like Roots or things like that. There have
Mhm.
been sort of epic television before that, but I don't think it's quite as what comes out in the early 90s. So if he was looking for a sort of film quality, massively epic, long stories, you couldn't do that in 91 probably, but that begins to come out with things like Twin Peaks and then into X-Files. And then really, I think you're right, into Sopranos becomes sort of the sort of first watershed there.
Pat,
Yeah.
I thought for sure you were going to say Wishbone. I was getting excited for it.
Wishbone was
All
later.
started with
Wishbone was a little
Wishbone.
later. Wishbone is
But
after Twin Peaks.
Heavily
Clearly,
influenced
clearly,
by
Wishbone
Twin
is heavily
Peaks.
influenced by David Lynch. Um,
who would Witchbone play in A Game of Thrones?
Hodor. No, I don't know.
Oh,
yeah,
Jamie. I think Jamie. But anyway,
Jamie? Oh, poor
he'd be
Wishbone.
He'd be Jon Snow. He'd be
He'd be a
he would
boring
be
old
three-legged.
Jon
Jon Snow.
Snow.
He would be
Yeah,
Jon
he would
Snow.
be
You're
He'd be
boring
right.
Peter
old Jon
Dinklage.
Snow.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, he would be great as
Right? Because he's
as
always making
Tyrion.
witty comments in
That's
Wishbone.
He
true.
could be. You're right. He could be
He
Tyrion. He
he
could
could be
actually be
Tyrion.
Tyrion. He
Mhm.
could be. Yeah.
All dogs are a bastard in their father's eyes.
Now here's the question, though. Yes. But the question is what so okay, if he's gonna play Tyrion, I totally agree. I think he's Tyrion. What is the human story that goes alongside of it?
All right, guys. So now let's look at the text, like we were saying. Not, I guess, not death to the author here, but it is kind of death to the author.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if one of the things George R. R. Martin was thinking was, if I put this many characters in my book and none of them are really a lead, how can you make a TV show about this?
His books seem to be somewhat carefully structured in terms of viewpoint. Like I think it is
That's one of the strongest points he has, yeah,
I do
definitely.
too. Yeah, I think he kind of balances viewpoints really well, and he also uses absence really well too. I mean, we don't get Cersei as a narrative character. She's sort of in the background
Yeah, until
of
book
everything.
4 or 5.
Yeah, until much later. But especially in that first book, you don't. She's this kind of monstrous character, maybe, but
Right.
she's kind of pushed in the background. I mean, they have to adjust that in the show, and I actually think that's some of the weaker parts of season one, like that ridiculous scene where her and Robert sit down and are like, "Did we ever have a chance?" No, and like, is this? Are you Ross and Rachel? What is this? But
Well,
but
it's
I think that
funny.
works well for the book.
I might be misremembering this, audience, so don't crucify me over this. But I think George R. R. Martin, he blogs a lot, and back in the day, I used to read his blog a lot. And I thought at one point he either said there or somewhere else he really liked that the show gave him an opportunity to put characters together that he couldn't get together in the book because he needed a POV, and no POV would have been in the room with just Cersei and Robert unless he made a POV that was Robert and Cersei. So he couldn't have that scene in the book, and he really liked that he got to put that into the show.
And yet Herman Melville had no problems having scenes narrated where Ishmael could never be. It didn't
Yeah.
bother Melville. Why did it bother George R. R. Martin?
Mhm. This is a good point. Yeah.
But I also think he liked the punchline in that, which is what's holding the realm together, our marriage. After you're seeing how terrible this
Yeah, and
marriage, I
yeah,
think.
the hate of it. Yeah, I had a hard time imagining these people would have this conversation. But I mean, regardless, that's not really the point I'm trying to make. The point is sort of like the benefit of the writing is this kind of multiple narrative thing. But Pat, to your point, that actually makes it really adaptable because you can just go like, here's a character, here's their scene or whatnot, and then what often happens with television shows is like a main actor can't be there for an episode or something, and so it's like, okay, the Daenerys scenes, they're going to be in episode 7. We're not going to have them here, so it just works really well for a television show. And the thing you lose is the characters you want to keep in the gray, like Cersei, like Robert, you really can't necessarily, or Jamie, right? Jamie and Cersei kind of need their own scene. You need their voice a little more present. I really didn't mind that though.
The thing, and I'd be curious, I haven't read them all, so I don't know how this goes. What it reminded me of is, and I'm guessing he has to have sort of borrowed this technique, the way that they're written. They reminded me a lot of Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time series. And KJ, I'm assuming you read those.
I have. I've read those once or twice, and then I've watched the first season. I don't think I watched the second season
I
of the
haven't
show.
watched the show. I read them like religiously as a kid. Like I loved those books when I was like 9 or 10. Like those were just I
Yeah,
loved
middle
those
school's a
books.
great time for
They
those books.
Yeah, and they drove me up I mean, the problem was I never finished the series because like firstly I was like, by the time I was like getting there, there were like 4 years between these books, so I'd kind of forgotten
Yeah.
everything about them. So I read like the first seven, like all in a block, and then after that, I read the first six in a block, and then I waited. The seventh came out like shortly after that, after I'd read them. But anyway, the he does that a lot in Robert Jordan does the exact same thing where he's got these sort of perspectives, and it's odd because I remember even as a kid because there were characters that you never got perspectives of, and then in like book four, probably similar to like what happens with Cersei, you'd suddenly gather perspective from some character, and it's quite jarring when you've had a character that's been there since book one and you've never had that person as a perspective. The thing that always drove me crazy about those books though was that what would happen half the time in like book six and book seven would be the characters were so scattered across like seven or eight different storylines that it became quite frankly it was really annoying because you'd get like we get one thing from one character's perspective in chapter two, and then you wouldn't see anything with that character until chapter 37.
Right.
And then all of them would come together in some sort of weird situation where they'd all show up in the city with the killer fog at the very end, and it was like that kind of thing. So I don't that was the thing that drove me a little bit annoying, and I wonder, does he manage to not do that where you sort of just lose characters for very long periods of time?
Well, I'll tell you. So, in a Wheel of Time, which I know this isn't a Wheel of Time one, I forget which two books, but two of the books are the same 15 minutes. It's just told from half the characters, and then the next book is the same 15 minutes told from the other characters. And Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire does that a little bit. Book four is only what's happening at King's Landing for that set of time, that month, that 2 month period. And then book five, A Dance with Dragons, is what's happening at the Wall and what's happening in Essos. I don't know if it's actually called Essos. I think we just kind of call, where Bravos and the Dothraki point, we call it Essos. I don't think it's been named that. Until it catches up. And then the last third of the book, it all comes back together. And nerds, if you are going to read the series, I highly recommend the Boiled Leather chapter order. They take the chapters from those last two books and put them in chronological order, or not quite chronological order, but chronological narrative order, so that you don't have that separation. But yes, that absolutely happens in A Song of Ice and Fire.
And that's what I think is interesting is it doesn't it's better handled in television than it does in fiction because which is interesting because you would think that fiction would be better able to handle massive numbers of characters across huge swaths of time and distance and kind of stuff like that, whereas it does, I don't know, I found it annoying in those other books. I can't, it sounds like it becomes a problem here as well as you get further on in the series. I didn't quite have that much of a problem when you get into the later seasons. I think the later seasons actually are able to better because television just television in general can do shorthand stuff much quicker, so you can have a 45-second scene that will just get the point that text might take 30 pages to make. And yeah, it might feel a little rushed, but you can kind of slow it down and just get that stuff out of the way and then move on to the next thing, whereas fiction can't do that. You can't just have like without really cheating.
In the later seasons of A Game of Thrones, they do stop adapting all the characters and they start to combine characters or give characters the role of who would have done it differently in the books. That's one thing they do. There's less characters in the later seasons of Game of Thrones than there could be in the books. I mean, the books haven't been released. I think this is part of the reason why. Also, in the later seasons of A Game of Thrones, characters seem to teleport. And I think
I've
it's
heard that complaint. Yeah,
yeah, well, and
they
I'm not.
said
It's not a complaint
fast
for me.
travel. It's like a video game.
Yeah,
It's a fast
I
travel system.
I think part of what that is the first time you travel the King's Road, it is so exciting. Like, what's going to happen on the King's Road? The second time you travel the King's Road, okay, well, we're going to subvert the expectations because we just traveled the King's Road. every time after that, why are we traveling the King's Road again? And I think that's part of what the teleportation is.
Mhm.
It would be boring for the audience to see that. Like, what more can you do with the King's Road?
But I mean, I've heard other problems like it's like, when they get stuck north of the wall trying to capture one of the whites. It's like one of the characters basically like somehow who's never been there somehow learns how to navigate, through the winter to the wall in a night, whereas it took them like 6 days to get there. And
Yeah.
then it's like that sort of thing where it's like, yeah, that's just plot insulation. That's just like
Plot armor, yeah.
you needed it to happen, and but it's also just lazy writing to some extent. Like you could have probably got this to be a little more realistic. You just That would have been a lot of effort. So we'll just have this character go.
So bringing it back to the text, the other thing I think George included in the books that he may have thought would have been tricky to adapt to television, I think in the books there aren't good guys and bad guys. I think the show presents the Starks as good guys and the Lannisters as bad guys. I think that's less. Um, I don't think that's pushed in the books like it is in the show. And I wonder if that's part of the. It kind of goes with there's so many characters and all of them are gray. Nobody's good, nobody's bad. How can an audience that watches television relate to that?
Well, I mean, so just to push against that a little bit, how would Eddard fit into this sort of gray space? Well, I think there's this, and this is what I get from the book and from the television show too, though to a lesser extent, is that it's political realism against chivalric nobility, right? That's what he's looking at. Martin is looking at a clash between, what actually happens in politics in this sort of Machiavellian model and this sort of heraldic, chivalric model of how to behave in the world as a noble person. And like Eddard is a good person to introduces the main character in the book because he is a representation of the failure of the chivalric model when it reaches when it reaches political realism in a politically real world. So I think for me, I see what you mean by like characters are more gray than evil. There's no Sauron here, right? There's no guy who's just
Right.
there's no pure appetite who wants to eat the
Well,
world.
there is eventually.
Yeah, in the show there is eventually.
Oh, there's
They
the white
they
people.
introduce the Night King or whatever.
Oh, okay.
Which again might be where the show starts to get a little
Yeah.
weirder.
Right. And
Yeah.
there's no hint of that in the book.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. But I mean, anyway, regardless, for like the earlier seasons before the supernatural stuff comes in, that's how I read, and it was a little bit of my frustration with the book. I actually think the show does this a little better, which is that they, like Eddard is a noble and good man, absolutely. Um, and the fact that he sires a bastard, even though he probably really doesn't, he didn't. I know. I read forward to that was my suspicion, but I checked on the internet to see.
Yeah, that was one of those things where the entire time I did not guess what the actual thing was going to be.
Mhm.
I did guess who the Ultimate King was going to be quite early. I was quite
Yeah.
proud of that one.
Wow.
Well,
I guessed it very early because I said he's the very first character you see, and I said they are trying very hard to give him a backstory that seems very good. They are really working to make him have
Mhm.
a story that would make sense for him. But anyway, sorry, but
I guess the mother. I did guess the mother of John. I didn't.
I
get
did
the
not. I didn't
father.
guess any of it.
Oh.
I didn't get it at all.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, I only guessed the mother after reading the book, though, or while reading the book. But anyway, I think that's how that worked. And so he runs into. So I think there is a noble and good person by a standard that the reader or the viewer would recognize as noble and good, and that's Eddard. And he runs into political realism, and then the person you end up admiring the most is Tywin, or is Peter
Tyrion.
Dinklage
Tyrion.
Tywin? Tyrion, sorry.
Tyrion.
Tywin's the father, right?
Correct.
Yeah, Tyrion. So Tyrion is competent in a political atmosphere. He's a good guy in the sense that he knows how to use this world, even though he isn't particularly physically fit or a great warrior or something like that. And that's why we end up admiring him because he understands probably better than anyone the world while still having the deficiencies of someone, that unlike his brother Jamie, who just is physically capable of dealing with this world. He isn't, but he understands it so much that he becomes the point of admiration.
But even if you wanted to go with the idea that it has no characters you really like, even if you want to go with Eddard, this is what makes it unfilmable, that or unable to adapt to television. I think you could argue that that he did actually, that Eddard was the character that was supposed to be the one that the audience could be like, this is where I'm going to anchor myself. And then I think I was very surprised when I first saw the show. I saw the show long before I'd ever seen the book, and I was very surprised they killed him off. Like, it is very surprising that they do that.
Yeah.
That's the character you've set that as your normative character. You're assuming he's your sort of like character that's going to carry you through this whole thing, and then they killed him off pretty quickly,
off with his
relatively
head.
speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that's a great point, Pat. So maybe that's part of what George is like, well, can't adapt this. I'm setting you up. You're going to get a mainline actor for this, and nobody's going to sign up for a role where they don't make it through the first season.
And no studio will sign off on that. They will never. No studio would have allowed that. Probably in 1991, they wouldn't allow you to kill off, Mulder at season 1. If Mulder died, it would have been great. It would have been hilarious. It would have made that show if you killed off Mulder in season 1. But you couldn't. They just wouldn't let you do it. They wouldn't let you allow. They would basically be like, you can't do that to an audience. That's like slapping them in the face, which it is, and it works pretty well.
Yeah. And it's more than, I think it's more than just slapping in the face, right? Because it's part of what he's trying to do. Or he's trying to set you up. This is what works in this world. This is what isn't. This old model of heroism isn't going to fit this world. That's not what's successful here. And so, yeah, and it's
well, it is in the North. It's just not, I think that's the big thing. It is in the North. It works quite well in the North, but it doesn't work down here. It doesn't work when you're trying to hold together these seven kingdoms.
Yeah.
Is it seven?
Yeah. Yeah, I sent KJ this. It's a map of Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms, and also a picture of England in 600 AD when they had the Seven Kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons. It looks exactly the same.
Yeah, except the Seven Kingdoms never actually existed, but that's fine.
Oh, did they not?
That's total, like,
yeah. Oh, okay.
It's like that's historical PS, but it's fine.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
But it's, I guess I should read. It is sort of BS, but it's also exactly how history is taught. Like, that is exactly how it is.
That's how I learned.
Taught. Yeah, that's how everyone's taught it. And I mean, we get it we get it somewhat in America. Like, that's how it's taught there. But most modern, historians would be like, it didn't really work that way. It's the same thing as like those maps that show, like, the barbarians coming into the Roman, Empire, and they're like, the Vandals came in this way and they came into none of that's how it worked. But
yeah,
that's a whole other story. But it's how it's taught. So since that's the story, then it totally makes sense.
Yeah,
just like Hamilton.
Still have yet not seen this show, so
it's wonderful.
I never ever will.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, so many people have tried to get me to see it. It's more enjoyable to not.
My wife saw it on Broadway. She got in on the lottery, and I will never watch.
So another thing, and this one's kind of the weakest of my points, but I think at the heart, A Game of Thrones is a complicated political drama.
Absolutely,
that's right. I think it's that before it's a fantasy. Well, I don't know before it's a fantasy, but that's why I show up.
It's using the fantasy genre to do that,
to do it right. And are there any television shows that have pulled it off at this scale with this many characters, this many families before Game of Thrones? I
was going to say Succession. I was going to say Succession, but that's not the same scale.
Right, and that came after. So
yeah,
again, in 91, 96.
In 91, nothing was close. Nothing was even remotely.
I mean, I haven't seen Dallas. I don't know what that's all about.
I mean, that's the closest thing you can get.
It's probably a soap opera.
Soap operas are the closest, and it's absolutely. I mean, Game of Thrones is a soap opera to some extent. It's an intelligent soap opera, but it is a soap opera.
Let's make that what the medium we want to adapt this into.
But it
I want to
is. It
adapt
already
this into
is.
30
You
frames
don't
per
have to
second.
adapt it.
It already is. It's just a soap opera that didn't air daily. Like you could have easily, you could have 100% strip out the CGI, make, just the dragons be outside of a window, and occasionally, they would blow the budget on something, and it is a soap opera. It 100% is a soap opera.
Do you want to get word to Kat? Yes, but she's in the north. Oh, is she? Zoom in on Littlefinger. Like, this would be such a good soap opera. They're looking in the mirror for some reason.
But it is. I mean, that's why I think it 100%. It already is. That's part of the beauty of why it's really cool.
But I want to see it shot like a soap opera.
By the way, I just want to. You said that they at the beginning that they have John. What is his name? The guy who was married to the one who's in the. Oh crap! Never mind. This is never gonna make.
Jon Snow.
No, the one who was married, John Arryn.
The one who died.
You said at the beginning. You said at the beginning that John Arryn was killed by the Lannisters. Wasn't he not killed by the Lannisters?
Yeah, he was poisoned by Cersei.
No, wasn't he poisoned by his wife? Because Littlefinger gave her the poison?
Oh my gosh, you're right. You're absolutely right.
I thought the guy who got killed in the duel was the poisoner.
No, you're right, Pat. You're absolutely right.
The duel that the mountain kills the guy?
Oh, the squire.
Yeah, wasn't he the squire to
No,
John
the squire
Arryn?
was the one. Wasn't that the one who got the king drunk? I thought that was the one.
No, that was another squire.
But that's part of what's fun about these books and show is,
and that would be, I do enjoy that was the only thing I always had with the series is my wife and I, when we watched them in very, very rapid succession. I'd watch seasons 1 and 2 back when they were first happening, because I was just interested in the series, and then I sort of fell off in season 3 because I just didn't have the time. But my wife and I were like, we are gonna watch season 8 when everybody else is watching it. So we must have watched 6 seasons of Game of Thrones in like a month.
Wow.
We were watching, like, she was pregnant and I was just home watching the kid all day. So we both were just like, we must have watched 3 or 4 hours a night of Game of Thrones, and we cranked through 6 seasons. And we would sometimes be sitting there watching and be like, I have no idea who that is. Like, I remember his face, but I don't remember what he wants or why he's here or who the other king. I think it's just like it kind of starts to blend when you watch them that fast, and there's no one else to talk to about what's going on. So we were just like, I don't remember who that is. And we didn't go to the internet to sort of try to piece it all together. So I apparently have muddled some of my stories.
So we're losing the high shelf status here, but I loved watching the show, and we watched it week to week with people, and we had a pause rule. Anybody at any time could call out a pause, and we would sit and discuss anything that we wanted to about the show. And a lot of it was
very helpful.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was so much fun.
Like a ticker tape on the bottom that would explain it.
Of who's who. But yeah, we would, a bunch of us were really into the books and really into the subreddit, A Song of Ice and Fire. And so we would just stop and somebody would say, well, who was that, right? Who was that person? And we'd say, oh, well, they're, so-and-so. And people think that he might be this or might, like, we'd get way into it. And the poor person was probably more confused after our conversation than beforehand. But it was so much fun. Which maybe this is a good segue into our next topic, Tom.
It is.
You had written a note about the monoculture.
Mm-hmm. No, you wrote that.
I wrote that. I wrote a note about the monoculture. Wow. I was gonna have some whiskey tonight. I'm
that
glad I didn't.
Shelf. Just to, this is the kind of class that I have. I'm drinking Captain's Daughter. That is an IME. You can't help but be tempted by the Captain's Daughter.
I had Dragon's Tears at a 10 ABV. So in celebration of this Dragon's Tears milk stout, I almost had the game.
That's actually a pretty good one, I think.
It's a very I like that beer. There was a Game of Thrones beer at the store, but it was a blueberry sour which sounds about as disgusting as a beer could sound. So,
I bought a Game of Thrones wine once, and it was just it was really gross.
yeah, I guess when you have marketing, you don't need
That was a
quality.
bad adaptation.
I got the it was the White Walker instead of the Johnny Walker whiskey
Oh,
as a
right.
gift.
That's
Yeah.
pretty good.
Yeah,
That's
I
That was
remember
awesome.
that.
smart.
Hmm
Mhm.
That was a good. Oh, I didn't know they did that marketing. That's a brilliant marketing.
That's a
And
good
it's
adaptation.
the
Yes.
Night King with the hat on. At the
Mhm.
You serious?
yeah. I can show you after we're done recording. I think I still have the bottle
I
clip.
want that.
Uh,
um, and since we're just gloating, the other thing we did week to week is our good friend Chris. He had gone to culinary school, so he made Sansa lemon cakes one time, which was this wonderful cake with sliced lemons on top that were cooked and sugared, and it
mhm.
was great. He made a blood pie one time. I don't know if it was actual blood, but it was a meat blood pie that was really good. We used to make mulled wine. Like we always tried to pair the show with something fun to eat.
But this gets into what you were saying here about monoculture. And you kind of, it looks like in the notes, or maybe when you were talking, proposed that this is like the last monoculture object, like cultural object that's out there. Um, do you think
Yeah,
so?
I do. I mean, there's still sporting events and Academy Awards. There's still other things that
Yeah.
are
Yeah, 2 weeks
monoculture.
from the Super Bowl is, yeah.
Yeah, and 2 months from the Academy Awards when we're recording here.
Yeah.
Um, but apart from that, right? MASH was a monoculture event.
MASH was a big thing.
Right?
Friends.
There was multiple Don
Mhm.
Johnson shows. Friends, great example.
Don Johnson.
Right? He
Yeah.
did what? Miami Vice and Nash
Mhm.
Bridges were
Mhm.
kind of big.
Big things.
Um, and I think Game of Thrones came out before streaming services are what they are today. But I think by the time Game of Thrones ended, I think a lot of people started
Yes.
watching Game of Thrones on their cable box and ended watching Game of Thrones on their streaming device. I think
Mhm.
it bridged that gap. And I think with streaming devices, you can make a show with a smaller audience and get a bigger audience
Mhm.
than you could before. And I think that's part of what's killing the monoculture, for better or for worse. So, what's really fun about the Game of Thrones monoculture was not only were tons of people watching the show who you wouldn't have expected to, right? It wasn't just nerds. It wasn't just people who had read Wheel of Time. It felt like everybody was watching it. And a bunch of those people then went and read the book. So, to answer one of our questions from previous episodes, I think the show reached a lot of people and encouraged a lot of people to read the books. And I had a lot of fun on Reddit. Um, Reddit is a website that is mostly a bunch of forums. It's broken into different groups, and one of the groups was A Song of Ice and Fire. And I think a little bit the show grew up with the internet. So the show comes out in 2011, and the internet's in full swing, but we all didn't have a smartphone in our pocket yet, meaning we weren't taking pictures and posting them immediately. We weren't tweeting in real time. Not all of us. Some people might have been, but not everybody. But by the end of the show, everybody's got the device in their pocket and it's constant. So I kind of feel like the transformation of the internet to that was with the show. Um, so what was really fun on Reddit was people would have fan theories and they would discuss them in great detail. And people would say, like, oh, but in this chapter, it contradicts this. And there was really fun fan theories. And one that came up pretty early that we've already talked about is who is Jon Snow's mom? And tons of discussion. Finally, somebody posted R plus L equals J. And the R was Rhaegar, who was the Mad King's son, a Targaryen, and L was Lyanna, Ned Stark's sister, equals Jon Snow. And all of a sudden, we all were like, "Oh my gosh, that makes so much sense! It makes sense why the way Ned's acting. It makes sense why it adds tension to the book because Jon Snow is a legitimate Targaryen. He should have the throne." Da 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 da. So that was a really fun reveal to have on the internet. Another one that came up a lot on the internet was Tyrion being a secret Targaryen. So the Mad King, King Aerys, was obsessed with Tywin's wife. And when Tywin and Joanna got married, supposedly the Mad King took the bedding ceremony a little too seriously and therefore somehow Tyrion becomes a secret Targ. So maybe it wasn't the betting ceremony, maybe it was later on. That there was evidence there, but I didn't quite subscribe to that one. But if you'll bear with me, audience, and my two co-hosts who have not quite gone glaze face, um, my favorite fan theory was D plus D equals T. Any guesses as to who is who in this?
Is Tyrion the T?
Tyrion's the T. So this is a Tyrion is a
Danny
secret Targaryen.
Danny.
is
Danny's a
Dan.
D. Okay, yep. And
Okay,
the other D. And
Drogo.
exactly.
Really?
Exactly. You want to hear how this theory goes? Okay.
Probably, yeah. Let's go for it.
It's so much fun. So we on Reddit they always talked about tinfoil, and the more tinfoil you needed for your hat, the more crazy the theory was. Okay, you're gonna need a lot of tinfoil for this. Danny and Drogo in book 1 in season 1, we know that Danny's pregnant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Danny goes into that tent and loses the child. That child was Tyrion, and as a fetus, he time traveled back into Joanna and was born there. But he's a Targaryen because he's Danny's son. This is
But
how
how
much
did
fun.
he time travel? I guess that's the point.
Yeah.
I mean,
we
I
have
know
to go back to the
You're-
posts.
it's all good. Yeah.
It's a bit of hand waving there, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that was one of the silly, like that's obviously that's
Yeah.
But
But I mean that is a lot of fun though. That kind of it's talking about monoculture and also speaks to this idea of adaptation, which is like fan theories, fandom, and fan fiction too are all part of this measure of how much one of these products has in terms of um its cultural impact. Like Harry Potter does this a lot, right? There is a ton of fan fiction about Harry Potter, and not all of it is porn. Some of it is people trying to seriously explore the aspects of the Harry Potter world that aren't put forward by
Wasn't 50
what's her
Shades of
name?
Grey a fan adaptation of Twilight? Wasn't
It was, yeah, it was, and then it became
and
its
then
own
then
thing.
actually
It
they
was
just
Frankensteined into its
they
own
said, okay, we'll
existence.
just take if he's not a vampire, he can just be a billionaire, and
Yeah,
then it's the same story.
yeah. It's apparently like two major fantasies in fan fiction is billionaire, vampire, or I think pirate is the other one. Like, if you want to write good fan fiction, make sure your mail is one of those three things.
Yeah,
Um,
everyone loves the sea.
yeah. You could also be a billionaire vampire pirate, I suppose. It's kind of Dracula, right, at one point. But anyway, yeah. But so I think like this like fan participation is sort of a measure of it, and it kind of leads to these like That's the nice thing about the internet, right? Which is what makes this show, part of the monoculture, but it also dissolves the monoculture. But in a certain way, it gives and takes away, right? Because it's the internet makes these kind of fan fiction things and these fan theories a community. You can adapt these things into purely internet stuff. I used to date someone who had she was a fan fiction writer, and like it was a hobby, but it was also she had a lot of people reading, and they would write her and say, ask her questions and and request her to write a little faster because they wanted more material. And so yeah, but it's also at the same time like the internet is the thing that gives us so much access that it breaks the monoculture. We're not all going to watch the end of MASH anymore. And you made this point, KJ, that this might be the last object of the monoculture, at least in terms of like television. Maybe we still have like the Olympics are coming up. I think that'll be pretty monoculture-y, and that will be aided by the internet because now you can see sports you normally wouldn't on television, like
right.
dressage or trampoline or something. But mostly in terms of television, yeah, it's going to be harder to do what Game of Thrones did because we just have so many options.
Yeah, and I guess I will just go back to the point I said earlier, which is like my wife and I were like, we want like I've never watched a show when everybody else was watching it. It's sort of like Battlestar Galactica had a similar thing where it was like everyone's searching to find the last but when I watched it was after the show was already over, so no one cared anymore. And it was sort of like I want to know, like I want to just participate in one of those things while I was going. And I did have a strong feeling that it was like this is not going to continue. It's not this kind of event is rare now. and not to say that it was common before, like you did need to have like sort of like a mash kind of thing, but there were just more of them. And most of the things that we have aren't fiction related. They're, as you said, they're sports related is the most common one, or they're sort of, I mean, I guess awards related,
Award
which is
show,
sort of
yeah.
sports. I would say that's just a
Live events,
variation.
yeah.
That's the sportsification of
Presidential
film.
elections.
Or
Mhm.
politics,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
sort of it's news and events like that. Like there's very little fiction or very little storytelling that can do that anymore. And I don't think there's anything out there right now that has a chance at that. I know, again, like Succession, just that one got some attention, but nowhere close to anything that Game of Thrones is getting. And I don't see anything on the horizon. I don't see anything coming close to it. I think it will be very, very hard. A lot of shows did it that started back in the early 2000s. Things like Breaking Bad or those kind of shows, but nothing. I don't. I agree with
Downton
kind of
Abbey.
KJ. I don't know if anything is going to quite get to the point again where we'll have a lot of significant number of people watching one thing.
Yeah, I mean, Stranger Things got close, but because they release a whole season at a time, there's no time to
That's the big
breathe.
problem.
There's
Yeah,
no time
you
to
Mhm.
can't
talk
do
about
that.
it.
Yeah.
Some of the Star Wars shows, they're not, it's not monoculture, but you can find a lot of people doing that. But it just doesn't seem to have the buzz or the excitement that Game of Thrones had.
I mean,
Yeah.
Barbenheim came close.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
But I
know
mean, like,
that's a
Yeah,
but
it
perfect
it, but
did.
example.
It
Yeah.
but it
did. Yeah.
did, but
Yep.
it was a pretty small subset of the
Mm-hmm.
population.
Mhm.
Like it came
Mm-hmm.
that's the attempt at redoing that, but it was a pretty small subset of the population, and relatively speaking, that it was a pretty fizzly kind of example of it. But it was the closest
Mhm.
kind of thing you're gonna get. You're just, and even Barbenheim, like you're not gonna get Gone with the Wind, where there
Mhm.
were just, lines around city blocks for weeks going to see Gone with the Wind, and people went to see it 7 times. Like you're just not gonna get that. Like I don't think that's gonna happen again. For unless there's some new medium develops that can do that. I don't think anyone's going to do that. No one's. I don't think you're going to get lines of people lining up in the metaverse or this. Like I don't think anyone's doing this.
Yeah, I mean it gets to this point of like the 19th century and late 18th century, the media made the I'll preview this as the media makes the monoculture, right? So whenever you have the new medium, it can kind of make that monoculture. So thinking of like um in the 18th century, you had a fairly small one, but something like a book like Pamela by Samuel Richardson, which became immensely popular. And there was like, like you'd get a Pamela coffee cup, and there was all these like junky plastic, not plastic, but what would have been plastic. And that kind of carries to the 19th century where people are, there's a few books that everyone is reading that are immensely popular. And then in the 20th century, it's movies, and you can have a monoculture around, like uh, Gone with the Wind, where it made the most money ever when adjusted for inflation, um, or purchasing power, whatever it is, and that kind of continues. I mean, even like Titanic. I remember in eighth grade, I think I was in when Titanic comes out, and like people in my class who were eighth graders had gone to see it like 6 or 7 times. They'd go back and back and back. It's when I remember like the Oscars were really popular because it was like they were going to award Titanic the most awards any Oscars ever awarded anything ever, that type of thing. There was the award show sort of fed into the media. Um, and then you think like as the 21st century is coming in and television is becoming more sophisticated and good. I mean, television existed before, but it's kind of hard to compare the quality of television now to like Leave It to Beaver. I don't think that's like incredibly aesthetically thrilling or anything. Like even X-Files doesn't, I think, compare in
No,
aesthetics to what you're seeing now. I think there's X-Files as quality, but it's still like there's still this kind of formulaic aspect to it. You don't
Mm-hmm.
need that. I mean, the closest thing, probably like you said, Pat, is probably Twin
Twin
Peaks. But
Peaks.
that's you
Yeah,
basically you had 2 seasons of that, and the second season was kind of crap. Let's get so
I
it's like
loved it.
yeah, well, but so it's a rarity, but now what's happening is because now you have the internet is now really more the medium than anything. um what ends up happening, we evolve into this sort of global village idea, but it's not a global village, it's a global locality. It's accessible anywhere, you can get anything you want, but it's creating not a global village but just internet villages, right? We're more we're more, I don't want to say isolated, but we're more parochial probably in terms of our media than ever before, just because the internet has made that possible, which is odd because it seemed like the scope of media was going up and up and up until, I don't know, now. And maybe like 2011 is that breaking point. It's the point where the internet becomes moves from being, something that 50% of the population or 75% of the population has to, 90% of it has it on a phone. And so you just don't need.
Yeah, and the bandwidth that everybody had was high enough now to stream video,
Mhm.
right? Before 2000, I don't know exactly what date you do, but sometime between 2000 and 2010, you couldn't really stream video on the internet, and all of a sudden you could. And not just you could, everybody could, right? There was enough bandwidth for everybody.
No, the only thing I want to throw out, as far as, I just want to throw out one thing, because the only thing I'll disagree with Tom on is the idea of like, um the idea that monoculture comes about in the 18th century, because I think it's existed long before that. I think there's something deep seated
Mhm.
in humanity that looks for that. And I would give, like, a couple examples. Like, some of these might be a bit obscure, but like one of my favorite ones is from like midi Byzantium in like the 6th century, 6th or 7th century. There's a great kind of thing where there's one guy who's talking about, it's like a first century source, or primary source from that time period, and he's talking about the Monophysite controversy. I won't get into this too much, but he jokes about, he's very frustrated because he says, he's like, I go to the bakery and and all I hear about is somebody telling me that Christ has two wills, and then I go to get my hair cut and I am told that Christ has one will but two persons, and
Mhm.
then I go to, I go to the race courses and I hear the, and he just kind of and he kind of jokes about how he's like, everyone has their own theory about this thing and they all are telling me about it. And
Mhm.
it's very, I mean, that's not that dissimilar to what KJ was talking about. There
Mhm.
was a very similar culture of this idea where these people had a thing that they wanted to talk about, and they didn't have Reddit, but they talked about it. And this guy is like, I am tired of hearing about this thing. And I don't think that that's, go to, Italy in, the time of Dante. There's some great stuff when Dante was publishing, the Divine Comedy, where he talks about how people actually thought he had gone to hell, and people were following behind him to like smell his cloaks to see if it smelled like, like, does it smell like brimstone? Like, I think there's a thing that people get, a culturally, an idea in their head or a topic in their head, and they really want to talk about it. And so, regardless of whatever the reality of that situation, or whether it's a real thing, of a fiction thing, whatever it is, they want
Mhm.
to talk about this thing with other people. And so the big question, though, I agree, but I agree to your point. Is this now becoming more parochial? Are we starting to split into smaller groups simply because we can? It's just, you're going back into small villages almost because we can. It's easier
Mhm.
to do it.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's this kind of thing, though, where people do this kind of thing. Like, it's a
Yeah.
very deep-seated part of humanity
Yeah.
that
People are.
wants to have these kind of esoteric discussions in which
Mhm.
they all, in which knowledge is, I guess they want to
Is
have esoteric
built.
discussions. Yeah, and they
Yeah.
they
They want to
want they
have
want to build a
esoteric.
lore. They want to
Mhm.
build a
They want
lore
to create
around
something.
something.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
should start a podcast. But on this podcast, we should start talking about adaptation. And to segue into something else Tom wants to talk about, I want to point out some great adaptation choices they made in the show.
Oh, please. That would be helpful. Yeah.
First of all, putting the map in the intro
Is a
is
really smart choice.
awesome. It
Mhm.
helps
That's a
you
very smart
visualize things.
choice.
And in the first season, it's kind of a standard intro. As the show goes on, they're showing you the places that are going to be in this
In
episode
that episode, I
specifically.
Mhm.
noticed that. Yeah, that was
Awesome.
very
And that
helpful.
map looks cool. I mean,
Mhm.
that intro is incredible. Another great thing, I don't know if this counts as an adaptation, but the previously ons were phenomenal. I was over at my in-laws, and do we have Game of Thrones on? It doesn't make sense. But my brother-in-law was watching Game of Thrones, and my mother-in-law said, "Why are you watching the previously ons? You've seen all the episodes. You just saw the last episode." And what they do in the previous ons is they don't show you what happened in the last episode. They show you what has happened in the series that is going to be important for this episode. So in season 5 episode 3, they might show you stuff from season 1 episode 4, because that's you need to have remembered. You don't need to, but the show will be better if you have remembered what Arya did in season 1 or whatever it is. and I thought that was a great choice. Is that an adaptation to the medium, to TV?
I think so, because the map is important in the books. Because when you look at the books, and I read the first book and I have the second book, though I haven't started it yet, and I may not. But knowing where they are in the world it makes it more understandable, right? The relationship, and so that map is important. And so I think the map is very helpful when it zooms in, and then you get the particulars of what's going on. And they have to have that space anyway, right? I mean, if it wasn't during the credit roll, then I might be annoyed by it. But because you need to do the credit roll regardless, it's like, okay, we're going to do something useful with this space instead of just giving these people credit. I think that was useful as an
Wow,
adaptation.
I'm sure the people who worked very hard on that would. we
Well,
can
you don't
just
want to sit
we
there
could
like
do we might
read
as well
their
do something
names.
useful, like giving them
Yeah.
credit for their work.
But as of you don't want to read their names again. You know these people by this point. Um, yeah, I think that's a useful adaptation. Another thing I will put. Oh, or KJ, did you have other
Nope, nope. That
adaptation?
was a segue
Yeah.
into yep.
Oh, yeah. Another thing I put forward is like I liked the television show more than the book,
I
and
did too.
yeah, my reason for it is the book is the book does some narrative things interestingly. I don't think in any particular narration, but the way he sets up characters is juxtaposed to one another. And I also think the given circumstances, the way he sets them up in the book, are very interesting. The political situation is really cool. Um, However, there is this sort of very somber and serious tone that when you have to read the book in a week for a podcast, can become a little exhausting after a while.
Try
And the,
listening to it in the car.
oh, I did. It was,
Yeah.
yeah, this was a tag team effort between my audiobook and my text. I think it was 32 and a half hours. Uh, but but anyway, yeah. So there's a kind of like seriousness to it, and the television show is so much more fun. And part of it is when I watched the first 5 seasons back whenever the fifth season came out. I don't remember when that was. 2016, I think. It was before I moved to Connecticut, so I think it was
Sounds about right.
2016.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I watched the five of them pretty in a pretty congested amount of time. And by the fifth season, I didn't want to see any more of it. And I think what turned me off was there's so much gratuity in it. There's just a lot of sex and there's a lot of violence, and the violence is kind of over the top. And I was like, oh, I really don't like this. When only watching one season and having a week to watch the entire season, the sex and the violence, it's kind of fun and it's in a fun spirit. And so one example is when Littlefinger has to give his backstory about his affair or non-affair with Cat Stark. Um, in the book, he just sort of tells this story about how he fought, or I don't even know if he tells it. I think somebody else tells the story about how he fought Eddard's brother for her, and how she had to beg for him not to kill Littlefinger. In the television show, he's telling this story to two women who are having sex with each other. And of course, they're like beautiful women, who are made up to look gorgeous and whatnot.
Why
And
don't you join us, my
yeah,
lord?
why don't you join us, my lord? No, I'm saving myself. Here's a long explanation. And it's super silly. Like, you're like, why is he telling this story to these
I think wasn't
women?
it there was like a thing that I think that was going around. They were calling it like sexplanation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's like I like that. I honestly, it's silly, and it is, yeah. It's yeah, it's exposition. It is exposition, but
Sorry,
like
it was sexposition. It was sexposition.
exposition,
Yeah,
yeah.
sexposition. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's also like it's a lot more fun, and the show just feels like it breathes and is a little more vital than the book. Um, like Varys is a lot. The actor who plays Varys is great.
He is fun. Yeah.
Yeah, he is fun, and I think he's a lot more. He brings a lot more life to it than the character in the book. But he's great. And then so the actors kind of fill out some of the characters that aren't really that well developed, like Braun the Sellsword. That was
Yeah,
my
he's pretty awesome.
favorite character. He was a very good actor. He doesn't have a lot to do, but he kind of really, that actor fills out that character a lot. And he also has a really good sense of humor, which you don't get from Braun in the book.
In the book.
Yeah, and I think with Tyrion, I think Peter Dinklage is far more charismatic than George R. R. Martin is capable of writing.
Well, you say that, but George R. R. Martin was heavily involved with writing the show. He wrote episode 8 for season 1.
Right, but it's also like it's the actor, right? Like Peter Dinklage is a very charismatic actor, right? It's hard to bring that kind of charisma to a written character. It's hard to bring that to a performed character. You just got to have it, right? And I think Peter Dinklage has it, whatever that undefinable characteristic called charisma is. And I think that makes like I much rather watch these actors do this than read the narration, which I don't think is. I don't think these characters are so complex that this isn't Leopold Bloom. I'm not like diving into their heads here and getting something. I'd much rather watch these people do that.
Lord Varys, he's great. He is by far my favorite character in the whole show. I loved him.
Yeah,
I liked him and Littlefinger. They're by far my favorite characters in the show.
I wasn't as fond of the Littlefinger performance, I think.
I just like him because I feel like he's like the hard-boiled kind of like you just like him because he's good at what he does.
Mhm.
And apparently he eventually fails, which I didn't see in season 7. But I kind of enjoyed watching. I kind of enjoyed watching.
Yeah, Varys fails, I think, in season 8, right?
He apparently dies in season 8.
Yeah, he gets burned by the tree.
He apparently he tries to turn on Daenerys
for Jon
because he tries to turn on Daenerys because he thinks she's going to go insane, and he basically is like, I hope I'm wrong, but he thinks she's going to go insane, and apparently he is right.
Yeah, he's an interesting character. I mean, I know this is off the conversation of adaptation, but he's probably the more interesting character, at least in the first book or the first season, just because I think the information they're giving you is that he is interested in the good of the realm and peace in a way that other characters either aren't interested in or aren't capable of bringing about. But he also has this conspiracy going with Daenerys to like bring her back to King's Landing. So which wouldn't be peaceful. It would be a peaceful thing to do. So I'm not quite sure.
I think generally speaking, he's sort of to put it in modern terms, I think he's effectively a fascist. He's a person who believes in a very strong central government to rule on behalf of sort of all the people. That I think is his ideal. I think that's what he generally, if you were to describe his political views. So I think that's his problem with the current situation with Robert Baratheon is he's he holds it together, but barely holds it together, and it's at the expense of a lot of corruption, a lot of sort of political issues. There's sort of economic issues, like, but he holds it together. So I think that's his argument is, well, at least the Targaryens held it together. Their problem was they went insane. So it wasn't the problem was that yes, technically they were better. There was just one of them was bad. So we need to bring back another one of them so that they can reestablish absolute control, and then that will provide peace and stability. He's basically a peace and stability at all costs. Like, it doesn't matter what happens as long as we have a strong central government. That's, I think, his, if you were to phrase him in any way.
And I think that's why he doesn't support Eddard, because
no.
He thinks Eddard would be a stronger person on the throne if Dany did show up. So he'd prefer the weaker Joffrey on the throne when Dany shows up.
Eddard Stark? No, I think he doesn't support Eddard Stark because Eddard Stark would blow the whole thing up.
But wouldn't he want that then for Dany to show up and be able to just pick up the pieces?
No, I think he wants it to keep as close together as it possibly can until they show up, and then because he doesn't want to have to piece it back together again. He wants it to be together when she shows up. Eddard Stark is a political moron. He would destroy the whole thing, and they would come back to rule over ashes, or to rule over everything would be 7 separate things, and they have to force it back together.
Conquer the 7 kingdoms again.
Yeah, he wants it to stay as close as it can until someone else can come, someone better can show up. And I think in his head, he thinks it's Daenerys up until apparently season 8, when he's like, oh shoot, she's insane. And so he kind of is like, well, I need another Targaryen. I think his idea is he's, again, I think he's a fascist. I think he's like, well, Targaryens rule. It's almost like, he's sort of like Virgil. Romans, you rule. It's like
Mhm.
Targaryens, you rule.
Mhm.
So it's Jon Snow is a Targaryen. Targaryens rule. Therefore, it has to now go to Jon Snow. I think that's
That makes
what his
sense, yeah.
overall theme is.
Because he's an agent of peace, with the exception that was my problem, was I don't know where he thought the Targaryens were going to fit into that. Because really, he's like, you need to support Joffrey, because if Eddard supports Joffrey, that really, well, first of all, it prevents the North from going to war, but it really does, it hurts the second brothers, the gay brothers' claim, right? Um,
And Stannis' claim. So Renly
yeah,
and
you get the
Stannis.
impression like
Renly's the third
Stannis
brother.
is doing, or the third brother, right? Stannis is going to do what he's going to do anyway. But there's less fracture if Eddard supports Joffrey. And he also, I think, along with Littlefinger, advises him to throw the knife that was attempted to use to kill Bronn away. Just ignore this. It's better that, it's better to just let the political system play out as it's going to play out. Because I do think, yeah, he is an agent for peace, as we're saying, but that makes sense what you're saying, Pat. Like, yeah, the only thing that's really going to restore strength in the Seven Kingdoms is a Targaryen, right? That's what we've done. That's what we've always done. That's what we need. They're the Henry VIII or Louis the 16th figure, Louis the 14th figure. Not Louis the 16th, Louis the 14th figure. That's what we're gonna do. That makes sense to me.
I think it's also, I just want to say, I think it's interesting you can have this type of discussion about this material. Like
Mhm.
it is very interesting. And whether, I mean, I think George R. R. Martin has thought of this. I think this is why all these pieces are in place. I think it's a cleverly conceived. I think that's its strength. Its strength is
Mhm.
its political considerations. I think this is why some of the later seasons blow up, because they're like, now we're gonna just have this malevolent white thing, and he's going to raise dragons, and he's going to. And you're just like, yeah, but what happened to kind of the fun? Like
Yep.
the
Mhm.
fun was watching these other things.
And I
Yeah.
think that's why he can't finish the books.
Yeah. Because there's the fun is that this never ends. This will
Right.
never end.
Mhm.
As soon as you get Bran on the throne, someone else is going to become a problem.
Hmm.
No matter what you do, that's just sort of life. It doesn't narrate very well. But I think that's the fun of the series when you take it to world-ending extremes, it kind of doesn't work as well.
Mhm.
So in the book, there's another Targaryen. There is Dany's nephew. Dany's
John,
brother? No, Aegon Targaryen. So he's over in Essos, and Varys or maybe the Cheesemonger are also getting him to gather an army to come back over the Narrow Sea. And Dany doesn't know about Aegon, but Aegon knows about Dany. So there is even more at play if we
Yeah.
want to get more.
I just think it's fun that you can do that, and I
Yeah.
think that's where the book's strength lies.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And even Tommy, your point about like that, I agree. Like once I was getting to season 5 or 6, I was kind of starting to get to the like, what is this thing with the ravens and the thou
Mhm.
this thing? It was
Mm-hmm.
just kind of like I'm starting to lose me now, because the
Mhm.
fun of it was watching a lot of the other stuff. Even when the woman was giving birth to the shadow baby that killed like, it's kind of like, I mean, like maybe. I mean, it doesn't need to be, fantasy, just like, versions of Rome, which, by the way, was a great HBO series. It has also a lot of similar things when you see
The
Caesar as just
secret
the king.
mission of this podcast is to get everyone to watch Rome from HBO.
Rome is great. I mean, again,
I
there's
don't doubt
like,
you.
but the guy who's the king beyond the wall, he's Caesar.
Mhm.
He's in it. A lot of them are in it. It's still a fun series. But the idea here that it doesn't need to just be like politics. Which Rome, that
Mhm.
was what Rome was. Rome was straightforward politics. It's actually very similar in some ways, to the political situation here that they're trying to portray. But it doesn't just need to be that. But it's when it started to really just lean on the supernatural elements more and more and more. Like it was fun. It was really, really fun when it was sort of a political dynastic struggle with some supernatural elements in there. When it became way more about the supernatural elements, that's when it started to lose me.
Yeah, because up to book 5, I mean, the dragons, I suppose, but the dragons seem more
They're a political tool,
in
though.
their
That's the
political
beauty
tools.
of
They're
them.
Yep.
more involved in
They're
the politics. Yeah.
Yeah, they're only used in service of the politics.
Mhm.
Like even when she, uses one of them to, trade for the armies and the Unsullied, and then she ends up killing some of the. Even then, that's a political tool. It's more about what the decisions that she's making as a
Mhm.
political individual, and the tools she's using sometimes are supernatural. That's why even the weird demon baby thing was at least is at least like it was a little weird, but I was willing to accept it. But it was when it just started getting more and more, and I'm like, I have no idea where they are. I have no idea why they're out here. This is the three-eyed raven. Like I was just like, I don't get this. Like it was more interesting and grounded when it was politics with supernatural tools. That was fun to my mind.
And they cut off there, KJ. My memory is that in the end of book 5, we're left with Daenerys going back to the Khalisad. Is that correct?
Yeah, at the end of book 5, well, leading up to book 5, Daenerys takes over Yunkai, takes over Astapor, and then the slave owners kind of rebel. Her life is threatened. Drogon shows up. She hops on the dragon and is flying, but she's not doing well, and Drogon's not doing well. So they land on the Dothraki Sea in the grass plains, and the book ends with her looking up as the Dothraki are coming, and she drops something on the ground, hoping that somebody will be able to find her. Like she's not in a good spot.
Hmm.
She's about to be captured by the
Yeah, but I
Dothraki.
mean, the point is like there isn't this White Walker thing hasn't become a real tangible threat yet.
It hasn't become the primary focus.
Yeah.
Right.
Hmm. Yeah, we're
Yep.
still in a Game of Thrones, so to speak,
Right.
playing the political battle. Okay.
No, so the White Walkers in the book, the where they are is they've gotten to Hardhome. I don't know if you guys saw that episode.
Oh, I don't
In
remember.
the show, I think it's one of the greatest episodes of TV ever made. John goes up to a
Oh,
town.
that one's so
Isn't
cool
it
when they
good that
show
it's
up and there's
yeah,
like and they're going
the
off on the
thump. Oh,
boats. Yeah, that was
Oh
yeah,
yes, I did see
yeah.
that was
that.
a good
Oh, that was good.
episode.
So
And that ends with him like raising his hands
Yeah,
to
and he
White
raised his
King,
arms and
and
all.
everybody
That
stands
was
up.
yep,
good.
That was
That
good.
was
great
solid.
episode. In the
Mhm.
book, that's a letter from somebody that was up at Hardhome, and all it says is, like Hardhome, everybody's dead. There's dead things in the water. That's it. That's the only clue you get that the White Walkers are marching
Mhm.
south.
And again, it's interesting when you see them trying to deal, again, politically with what this is a world-ending problem. We all have to get together and deal with it, but they don't really do very well with it. They just keep leaning back on like, okay, well now we're gonna have dragon CGI, and now we're gonna have this. They kind of start it, and then they can't help but lean on their massive HBO budget.
And that I think that brings us to another point I wanted to make. Part of the problem is they run out of source material, and so they have to. You're no longer adapting. You're generating new work from an existing world. Um, and that's kind of an interesting problem to deal with is like adapting unfinished or incomplete work. I mean, the one I thought of, which I put in my notes, was the last Charles Dickens book, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which has been adapted many, many times. But basically, it's a mystery. But Dickens died before saying who the person was. Who I think it's a murder mystery. I haven't actually read it, but it's a murder mystery, I think. And Dickens died before saying who. And actually, nobody knows. I don't think there's any notes on it or anything. And so it's been adapted into a bunch of movies. But there's one famous one. There was a musical in like 1985, which was written by the guy who wrote the Pina Colada song. If you like pina coladas, he's apparently a very good, successful Broadway composer and playwright. But anyway, and I've seen it. And what they do for the Mystery of Edmund Drood is he wrote every possible ending and then has the audience vote, and they can vote on who the person is, and they can vote on other things. He has like secondary things you can vote on, like which couples do you want to see get together and things like that, and just wrote every possible ending
Wow.
and had the actors memorize it. And it's kind
Jeez.
of the problem with that is it's kind of cheesy, but he then rewrites the entire play so that it leans into the cheese.
Hmm.
So it's not this kind of disjointed thing.
Sounds like a Telltale game. Remember the Walking
Yeah,
Dead game you played?
I mean it's a little silly, but it's the only example I could think of where like you're trying to adapt incomplete material, right? And it becomes a sort of game between um
I mean, but that's what Amazon's doing with J.R.R. Tolkien right now.
Mhm.
That's exactly what they're doing. I
Aren't they
mean,
doing the Silmarillion?
yeah, but aren't they taking it and they're sort of adapting it and changing it, from what I understand.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that's
haven't
true.
seen
They're
it, but
they're
I
they're
haven't seen it, but
taking
my understanding is they're not. It's not quite. I mean, because Silmarillion even is like it's a it's a book. It's a book in the sense that, like, it's a collection of notes and things like that that are sort of put together to make something. It's not a narrative in and of itself, I would say.
Mhm. I mean, it has narratives in it, it has a few of them, but it feels more like a elvish Bible than a
Yeah, I mean, I
than a
was
single
going to
story.
say it is something like that. Like,
Yeah,
it doesn't have an overarching.
Mhm.
um
It doesn't have one single overarching story where you're getting a ring to a place.
yeah, and
It's
that's
a
the thing, is like
bunch of stories.
it's not quite a narrative story per se. But anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, but I no, I think that's a good point, though. I mean, it still works in the same way, right? It's like we're going to, and I don't think they had the rights to every part of the Silmarillion. So part of it is it's a rights issue where you have certain characters you can adapt, but then you have to sort of invent stuff that's consistent with this world. But I mean, I guess in the Amazon show, you also have to make it consistent with the Lord of the Rings movies. So it ends up becoming the audience sort of structures what is possible to adapt and what isn't, based on an expectation of these movies and the assumption that either they can't get the material because they don't have all of the Silmarillion isn't copyright available, or just the assumption that probably most people have not actually bothered to read this thing and we can't make it into it doesn't convert as easily as Lord of the Rings does anyway, so we're just going to make stuff up and use this world as a foundation for that. Um, and so it becomes an interesting problem where you have you have like the soil, but you don't have the plants, right? You don't have the garden or you don't have the forest. And I guess we could see, and I guess it's a very old problem because if you look back at like Arthurian legend, like you start seeing Arthurian legend as early as like the early 11th century, where things are being written about Arthur, and people who are writing King Arthur stories in German or French or English or what have you, like they're relying on a stock of stereotypes about these characters. There's a stock of common knowledge about like who Arthur is, who Lancelot is, who Percival is, who gets the chalice, right? Who gets the grail? Which character is going to get the grail? What does that mean, etc. And you could do some variations there, but you can't do too many variations, right? Percival can get the grail. Galahad can get the grail. I don't think Arthur can ever. But you can do some variations or whatnot, but it's based upon a kind of collective knowledge. And it seems like, yeah, the Amazon show is doing that as well. It's like we know this world well enough, and we can kind of make stuff up within it. Um, it's a more difficult problem, I think, with the Game of
Game of Thrones is
Thrones.
way better conceived. Like, with
Mm,
and again, politically conceived. That's the problem with it, is that it's way better politically conceived than Tolkien really was. Tolkien's
mm,
mythology. That's George R. R. Martin's greatest thing, is his politics. And when he
yeah,
gets to when getting to the end game, I don't know if they knew where it was going.
yeah. I know the world isn't as interesting as Tolkien's, so you can't like. I don't think you have that kind of possibility. Now, there's a prequel to Game of Thrones, right? There's the House of Dragons.
House of the Dragon, yeah. So George wrote a book, and then HBO adapted it into a show. I'm not with George R. R. Martin. He's a producer. He's involved, but I don't know how much writing he's doing for that.
Yeah. So he was able to write another book as a prequel, but not finish the.
Oh, multiple.
Robert Jordan
Oh,
did that too. Robert Jordan did the same
Yeah.
thing.
oh, did
Yep.
he?
Yeah,
Mm.
he couldn't finish the series and he wrote prequel.
No,
Yeah.
I guess that's a way to.
I think they get stuck. I mean, I get
Yeah.
it. When you're 7 or 8 books in, you don't quite know how to finish it.
Mhm.
Prequel might help you to collect your
Why not?
thoughts.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's probably more interesting, more fun to write. Scratches an itch.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The other fun thing is the prequel starts with the first Targaryen coming over and conquering the Seven Kingdoms,
Mhm.
and book 5 ends with Jon Snow dying. So in my head, great, we completed the Targaryen male line story. Like,
Yeah.
we're done.
Yeah.
We got it.
There you go. How is it? How have you seen the House of Dragons or read it?
I read the books. I really enjoyed them. They're not as cohesive as Song of Ice and Fire because it takes place over much longer periods of time. So you get the POV chapters, if I remember correctly, but all of a sudden 30 years will pass, and it's just that disconnection's kind of tough. You have to just enjoy it for the smaller stories that are in there, and I think it really suffers in the show. The show also felt smaller to me. Right, a Game of Thrones, the opening scene after the first time you see the credits, it's this wide empty field and you see the knights coming up like a Kurosawa film or something. It's
Hmm.
amazing. House of the Dragon, everything felt like it was inside or walled in. Even if it was outside, it felt like there was walls around me. I don't know that
But
I
is
ever
that the
went outside
point?
to
I mean,
shoot.
again, is that the point?
Hmm.
Because it's a claustrophobic environment. Like this is supposed to be political. Again, now we're back to politics, back to city
Hmm.
living.
It could be, but King's Landing never felt like I was walled in, right? There's wide shots of King's Landing.
That's true.
There's those rooms are open. That throne room in A Game of Thrones, it feels vast. Like the people are small when they're in
Hmm.
there. In A House of Dragon, it's always close shots of people in that throne room. I don't know that you ever see the whole throne room or things like that. It was my memory of watching it. I don't think I got through the first season.
I mean, those are some of my kind of differences. There was I just think the television show is just a lot more fun, and it's able to put a lot of kind of those, and it doesn't actually do too much exposition, right? From what I remember, um,
Very little.
yeah,
Very,
very
very
little. You don't
happily
get,
little. Happily
yeah,
little.
you don't
First
get.
season's great. First
Hmm.
season's happily little exposition. You just roll.
Hmm.
Doesn't matter
Yeah,
if you don't know who everyone is. It's fine. You'll figure it
you'll
out.
figure
Like
it out later.
you assume someone. I'm willing to trust them. They'll tell me who the person is eventually. Like I don't really
Hmm.
care.
Yeah.
Something like Littlefinger or any of these people, I'm happy. It's very Greek actually. It's sort of like in the middle. You just sort
Hmm.
of show up and you show up and you go with it.
Hmm. Yeah.
What is that one? What is I'm blanking on the term. Tom,
In
what is
media
it?
res.
In media res. Yeah, I was like, it's not in vino veritas.
It's a little of that too, but it's
Yeah.
unrelated. Yeah.
Anyway,
One of the things they do a lot, especially in the first episode, John says to Bran, "Father is watching, and your mother." Like, audience, we have different like, I take orders from your father, not you. As your brother, da 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 da. Oh, you're Ned Stark's bastard. Like they're constantly using the family relationships, which I think helps. Like it didn't
Mhm.
feel forced or unnatural, but it's not quite exposition, but it.
Well, it's a natural way in which that would happen,
yeah.
right? We're having a conversation. You're getting information out of conversation as opposed to
As we both know,
yes, as you know,
those are my
I'm your bastard
words.
brother.
As you know,
Yes, I do know
we
that. Thank you.
we live in Westeros. Like I hate that. It's like
Yeah,
we
yeah.
are here in the north. You live in King's Landing in the south where it's
Mhm.
warm. I don't like it up there. And I'm like, oh God.
Uh, yeah. But is there anything you thought the book did a lot better than the show?
No.
Yeah.
I will give my answer. No.
I think in the book Eddard comes off as kind of a bit dull. He kind of does in the show too, though. I guess it's when you have like an actor like Sean Penn kind of grounding it. It's you have a little more sympathy for him. Um, he just that was kind of the big weakness for me in the book, and it's kind of the point of that I think Martin is going for, which is this honorable lead doesn't belong. But oftentimes he just comes off as sort of conveniently stupid for for different reasons. I mean, like the scene with him and Varys in the prison where he's like, "You didn't stick up for me in the throne room.
Right.
What
Like,
did you
come on.
expect him to do?" Like, it's, you think this guy is going to like pull out a sword and fight off the king's guard? You know what I mean? Like he seems utterly dull to he seems too stupid, I think, is what I'll say.
Oh, one other thing I forgot to bring up, another adaptation that I really liked. In the show, each season, the ninth episode of the 10 episode series is the big one. And then they have
Mhm.
the 10th to do the wrap up. So I think that felt better than most shows that I see, where the last episode, the finale, is the grand finale.
Mhm.
In Game of Thrones, usually the ninth episode felt more like the finale, and then they still had an hour to do wrap up.
I
So
never
season
noticed
one,
that, but that's quite clever. That's
yeah,
good
Yeah.
writing. Yeah,
right?
that's good
It is.
writing. I didn't notice that, but that's good writing.
Mhm.
Season 1 is when Ned dies. Season 2 is the Battle of Bayswater.
Mhm.
I guess in
Season
my head I thought they were occurring in the 10th episode, but you're right, they
Yeah,
weren't.
they
Mhm.
give you time to
That's
breathe
clever
with that.
writing.
Yep, I think it
Mhm.
works really well.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I was surprised by that too because I had remembered Ed dying in the 10th season, like you did. But yeah, no, they have the whole thing afterwards.
Again, one could argue it's sort of more respect for the audience. It's like we don't need to kill him and then assume you won't tune in next
Yeah,
next
yeah.
September, next
Right.
September and
Mhm.
find out if Ross and Rachel will end up.
Yeah.
We will assume you have a little
Mhm.
more respect for you. We will show you it, and then we'll show you what happens, and then you find out what. Then you'll show up next season to find out.
If you enjoyed Game of Thrones and are looking for more adaptations of A Game of Thrones, check out the graphic novel from 2013 and Game of Thrones, a Telltale game series from 2014. You can rate and review this show anywhere fine podcasts are available. For those viewing in YouTube land, if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the Talking Studios channel for all our exciting content, and follow us on social media at Talking Studios. Check out other shows by Talking Studios, including Talking Pictures Trivia, where we explore movies through trivia, Keep Making Movies, where we explore micro-budget films, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games, and Get the Point, where we slowly reveal a movie poster and try to guess which movie poster it is. Got a question for us? Call the Talking Studios hotline at 201-467-8679 and leave a message. It may be featured on a future episode. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Adapt It, wherever fine podcasts are found. Join us next time when we discuss The Trial and look at the 1962 film The Trial.
Wow, Talking Studios.
Next week, we'll be discussing The Trial. Pat, if you could adapt The Trial into any medium, what would it be?
So I saw something recently online that was like an article talking about Elmo, and it was like Elmo's Dark Night of the Soul, and so I would do it. I would do the trial with Muppets, similar to like Muppet Christmas Carol. So the whole thing, it would have to be that like Joseph K would be a total straight man, just like Michael Caine in Muppet Christmas Carol. He would not get the joke. He would play it just like exactly straightforward, and everybody else would just be around and would be Muppets. And I think that would draw. I actually. I'm not even joking. I think it would be like I think it would draw out a lot of the absurdity of the whole thing. I think that would be a fun adaptation.
I think that would work really well.
Very good.
And if
Oh.
that audience doesn't make you want to know what the trial
Mm.
is, that is a legitimately real option for this. KJ, what about you? What would be your adaptation?
So the first thing that came to my mind when watching this movie, wait, let's start. So have you guys ever played a video game in the genre a walking simulator? You ever heard this walking simulator
Yeah, I
genre?
think
Yes.
so. Is this the one with the I think you showed me where the guy
Like
walks in
Last
the
of Us, wasn't
sand?
that a walking genre?
Which one, Pat? What was it?
Last of Us or something, wasn't that a walking simulator?
No, so in a walking simulator, there's no killing, there's no
Yeah,
points.
that's it. But you just kind of walk. But I thought people die sometimes in them. But like,
They can do, but so I'm picturing a walking simulator game based on The Trial. I think it'd be real similar to another walking simulator game, The Stanley Parable, where you're walking around and you're gonna go through a door, and then all of a sudden you're somewhere completely else, and the narrator and stuff is kind of yelling at you like they are in this movie. So I was thinking a walking simulator based on The Trial might be fun. How about you, Tom?
I would like to adapt it into a card game like Solitaire in which you cannot win. Like there's this presumption you can win. Like you could play the Solitaire, you put out the cards and whatnot. And you could get all of the suits in the order deck or whatnot, but the rules are as such that you can never ever ever get there. And in fact, you're not entirely sure what the goal of the solitaire game is. You know how to move the cards around. You know enough rules to do that, but you're not sure to what end or why. And so I would like to adapt this into, yeah, using like a traditional 52 card deck, a version of solitaire in which it seems like you can win until you realize you don't know exactly what the goal is.
It reminds me of there's a choose your own adventure supposedly where every ending is a bad ending. Like there is no good ending, and there is one good ending, but it's a page that none of the other pages ever lead to. So you so the only way you can get the good ending to the choose your own adventure is just to cheat and read the just find the page in the middle.
When you're
Alright.
blue and you don't know where to go to. Honor.
I want to watch that movie now.